Schrodinger was an Austrian physicist who received the Nobel Peace Prize, not the Peace Prize, but the Nobel Prize in 1933. You may have heard of his cat. Not his pet, but a theoretical exercise based on Einstein's work in which a cat was placed in a box with a bottle of poison. When the box was opened in this theoretical exercise, sometimes the cat would still be alive, maybe giving us a look that only cats could give. And other times, the cat would have died. We would not know whether the cat were dead or alive until we opened the box. Schrodinger would actually say that the cat was simultaneously both dead and alive until we opened the box, because it was our act of opening the box that forced nature's decision as to whether the cat were alive or dead. In the quantum world, objects exist as blurry possibilities until they come to be observed. Only then do they come into focus. In the world as you and I see it, things can only exist in one place, in one state at a time. I guarantee you that it would stay there until either I or someone else were to pick it up, regardless of whether we were looking for it or not. But in the quantum world, things only exist once they are observed. If your heads are spinning right now, it's okay. So was Einstein's when he shaped this theory. Erwin Schrodinger eventually transitioned from quantum physics to conceptual biology, a field that would seem to be a bit more concrete. His foundational contribution to that discipline: what is life? So while there are some people that would say that we only have the internet so that we can watch silly cat videos, there are others who would say that without Schrodinger's cat, we would not have the internet. Quantum physics is a science that explains how everything works, how the smallest of particles come together to form matter. Physicists would say that when those particles transform, we have a quantum leap. So if I were to ask you what comes to mind when you think of quantum leap, what would you say? Oftentimes, we think of ships, or as my 13-year-old nephew said, time travel. Clearly, fiction writers and pop culture, there have been numerous television shows and movies written about characters who transcend both time and space. But what do quantum leaps mean for the rest of us? In this dimension, those of us who are not physicists, how could quantum leaps be relevant in fields outside of physics? We could say that quantum leaps occur when we have massive transformations, where one thing changes to another thing. But because quantum physics concerns itself with the smallest of particles, could a quantum leap also not be tiny changes that occur over a period of time that, when they're taken together, make a significant impact? What if we were to think about quantum leaps as they relate to learning, growing, and maybe even failure? You've likely heard or may have been asked, what would you do if you could not fail? So I'm not going to ask you that. Rather, I will ask you, what would you do if there was a 15% likelihood that you would fail? You see, researchers have established something called the 85% rule, which means that when we succeed roughly 85% of the time, we are more likely to persist, learn, stretch, and grow. If a challenge is too simple, we don't learn anything. But if it's too difficult, we often become discouraged, frustrated, and we give up and move on. But when, on average, we succeed 85% of the time, we're more likely to stay with it, and we transform from a state of not knowing to one of knowing. Growing up, my brothers and I, we would visit our grandparents, and they lived on a farm in the southern U.S. state called Mississippi. And typically, we would visit them in the summertime. And while the climates between the United States and Malaysia can vary greatly, summer, July, which is the month that we would typically visit them, July in Macon, Mississippi, and July in KL are more or less the same. Hot, hotter than hot, and humid. Interestingly enough, one year our parents took a winter holiday, which meant that we visited our grandparents in January. And the weather in Macon in January is drastically different from the weather in KL at any point of the year. While it's not the coldest place on earth, it is quite cold, and it's a place where when you get up in the morning and you step outside and you feel the cold air, you say good morning and you can see your breath leave your mouth. And during this particular visit, it was really interesting because as I was recalling this visit, I don't remember that we ever slept in any of the empty bedrooms, my brothers and I. Rather, we slept in the same room as our grandparents, and I would imagine that it was because in their home they didn't have central heating. So they would put these blankets down, they're really comfy, and we would sleep near these heaters that looked a little bit like this. I will say that it was a bit strange trying to find this image because never before in my life had I had to have searched for something and typed the word antique when I was looking for a picture from my childhood. But essentially, we slept next to, not too close because you could see that there was an open flame there, these gas heaters that would emit heat in the room. So fast forward a few years, I was living still in the US in a place that got snow 5 months out of the year. And we were in the process of renovating our bathrooms. And so I thought, you know, it's quite cold for almost half of the year. Since we're ripping the floors out anyway, why don't we install these radiant heating pads under the tile so that we could preset the temperature of the floors, and then when we wake up in the morning, we have these nice, toasty, warm floors. Some people might say that to go from antique gas heaters to preset heated floors would be a technological quantum leap. But is it really? When we look to history, we find that similar technology existed in ancient Rome. They were able to heat their floors, their walls, their ceilings, and even their pools and their bathhouses. And you know, as I traveled, I remember going to the United Arab Emirates several years ago, and on another trip to India, they had similar technology as it related to air conditioning. So the ancients had AC. It was incredible to think about. So a lot of times when we think about technological advances, sometimes they may not be quite as disruptive as we imagine them to be. Rather, they are rediscoveries, reinventions, if you will, of ancient technology, steeped in ancient knowledge and tradition. Sometimes technological advances can make leapfrog, if you will, where people start in one state and they skip over a phase completely. So about 15 years ago, I was leading a group of university students through South Africa, and we spent some time in the township of Soweto, which is in Johannesburg. And I remember so clearly that there was a woman who had a small shop set outside of her home where people would line up and they would pay her money to make phone calls to their friends and to their family. And I just thought, wow, this woman is really innovative. So there was this telephone that was attached with this long cord to a wall on the inside of her house, and there would be 15 people deep every morning waiting to make a phone call. A recent study showed that in South Africa, as of last September of 2018, over 80% of the population had access to smartphones. And that's up from just over 40% 2 years prior. So to go from a population where 60% of the people had access to no phones at all, to one in which over 80% of the people have access to smartphones, I would say that that's a quantum leap. How do we go about defining these? You know, I'll give you another set of examples. I also think that quantum leaps can be intergenerational. So this woman on your right, her name was Eliza Sims, and she spent the first third of her life in slavery. She lived to be 88 years old. And seated next to her is her daughter, Julia, Julia's husband, Solomon, and their daughter, Mary. Mary was my great-grandmother, and here we are today. I would venture to say that most of us have similar types of stories in our families, whether they were 4 generations ago, 14 generations ago, whether it was one person or a series of people who made some sort of quantum leap to bring us to where we are here and now. So how is it that we go about making quantum leaps, or making quantum leaps that impact other people's lives? I first met Nandar, a woman from Myanmar, 10 years ago. She was a nursing student who had already earned her first bachelor's degree in English literature. And while I thought that was an interesting combination, I really came to appreciate it even more as I came to understand her journey. So Nandar, she grew up in a remote part of Myanmar, and as a child, she loved to read. And because of her love of reading, she was able to develop fluency in a multitude of languages, one of them being English. And with that skill, she was able to launch a small tourism business where tourists would come and she would take them on treks through the countryside. And as her business grew, she earned money. She was able to buy land for both her and her family. Life was good. On one particular trip, she had a group of German tourists. And as they were trekking through the remote Myanmar countryside, word had gotten out that there was a Myanmar woman who could communicate with people from the outside. So one particular community decided that they had to track her down because one of the grandmothers in the community was gravely ill. And they thought that perhaps Nandar, since she could communicate with people from the outside, that she would be able to get the necessary medical help that they needed for their grandmother. Unfortunately, no one in that group had the necessary medical knowledge. And one evening, while Nandar was there with the German tourists, sitting by the bedside with members of the family, the grandmother passed away. And in that moment, Nandar realized that this was a moment in which she needed to step out and do something. So she sold her land so that she could finance her education to study nursing. First in Thailand, and then on to the United States. She now has her graduate degree in nursing, and she remains deeply committed to transforming the healthcare system in Myanmar. So, how do we go about creating quantum leaps in other people's lives? And who are the people that have created them in ours? I would like for you to close your eyes just for a moment and to think of someone who has helped you to make a quantum leap. Preferably, it would be someone who is still alive, so that when you go home, you could sit down and write a letter to them, maybe 200 or 300 words, thanking them. And if they live nearby, perhaps you can stop by and see them, maybe read the letter, share the letter with them. If not, give them a call and share with them how they have moved you, how they have inspired you, and how they have helped you to transform. Thank you.